So in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by two powerful women working in healthcare communications. We have Ruth Rogers and Jane McKimm, who are joint head of communications at the Southern Health Trust in Northern Ireland. They job share. Ladies, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're talking about podcasting, and the first thing that I want to know is, and Jane, I'll put this question to you. Where did the inspiration or motivation or idea for a podcast come from?
To be honest, it's quite mundane. I like podcasts. I'd listen to them all the time. And of course, in public sector communications, we're always looking for a new way to do things. And reaching large numbers of very diverse staff is a really difficult thing to do. So I mean, we have a notice board up in the office here, which I can see here, and it says podcast on it. And I have left it there deliberately because it was like a thought process, and Ruth's smiling because she knows. But so we had written it up as a thing that we think we'd like to do, but we had no idea how we would do it and what we would do. And we tossed it about, hadn't really come to any conclusions. And then the pandemic happened. And suddenly the whole thing just opened up. So from a concept to something we'd like to do to something actually I think we knew we needed to do, there it was, and off we went. And we've never really looked back.
And it's quite interesting that that's a trend in public sector communications, that COVID sort of parachuted comms teams and organisations into a place of agility and speed and transformation almost overnight. And perhaps, let's face it, if we weren't living in a pandemic, maybe you wouldn't have the podcast now. But it's time to move over to you, Ruth. This is where the story then develops. So the idea of the podcast, the pandemic comes. What was the next steps that happened?
Well, you're absolutely right, Joanne. Whenever the pandemic happened, our staff, of whom there are almost 14,000, were suddenly dispersed all over the place. They were in their attics, their kitchens, their living rooms, and we had to find a new way, an additional way on top of all of the products we already have, but another way to communicate with them. And that word podcast was still up on our notice board in the office, and we thought, right, we're going to have to do it. And I'm going to be honest with you, it was a bit rough and ready. We bought a cheap mic, and we installed an app on our desktop, and away we went. And I'm afraid that was as technical as it was then. But that, I think, is what's brilliant about a podcast. We didn't need huge, high-priced tech equipment to do it. We could just get started. And one of the things with COVID, when it arrived, we had to be able to communicate changes to staff. And the difficulty with COVID was the guidance was changing so rapidly, particularly with things like PPE and personal protective equipment. And you'd have one set of guidelines 1 week, and then as more information came to light, those guidelines would change. And so the podcast became one of the key mechanisms that enabled us to continually update staff and provide very complex information, and to give a more in-depth look at it than you can do maybe in via newsletter or any other.
So Jane, when you had that original idea of podcast and it was for all to see on the notice board, what did you think it might become? What was your vision, or how far did it stretch?
Well, it wasn't, one of our difficulties is how you turn very big corporate things into something that people will engage in. And that's what I always loved about podcasts, is that they're entertaining and they're engaging, and you learn. And you learn when you're not really learning, you're listening. And, Ruth and I have this conversation all the time, is how do we turn that big, difficult stuff into something that staff will go, oh, yeah, that's me. It applies to me. That matters to me. And I mean, Ruth's example of the PPE was perfect. PPE was a big, scary concept. When you turned it into, this is why and this is what we need to do, suddenly it lives and breathes. So my original, our original idea was a broad, how do we engage with staff? Right? It is the hardest thing in the world. Anybody who works in public sector communications, that is the thing. And there's no one thing, there's lots of things. So the long-term conceptual thing, which was no way formed There was no plan. There was nothing on a page. It was just, could this be something that we might use to translate what we want corporately into a language that staff would get, would understand? And that was it. I mean, there was really no, it was just, this is a thing, what can we do with it? And actually, I think what we've discovered in the year, actually, you can do lots with it. And I'm not even sure we have even tapped the potential of it. What COVID did was give us that very important thing, was it gave us a route in and a leg in and a focus. That's what COVID did with it. Instead of it being something that was so vast you weren't sure what you do with it, it became something that actually was so specific. We knew what we could do with it. That's what COVID did, and that's why it was able to move. And I mean, I don't think we've even tapped what we can do with it, Ruth. I'm sure you probably agree. It's been the quickest learning tool ever. So what do we do with it now?
So Ruth, on that, it was to serve a communications needs, specifically internal comms, reach staff with speech content, as Jane so rightly put, that is accessible, that's engaging, it's entertaining, and you're learning without even thinking that you're learning, and it's memorable. The knowledge is memorable. What did you call the podcast, and what were initial reactions in getting it out?
It's called SouthPod. So anybody watching can subscribe, and I'm afraid, again, like a lot of things that Jane and I do, we were having a cup of coffee going, what do we call it? There were about 3 options and we went with that one. So it has kind of stuck, but it resonates with people and they've liked it. I think the point that you're making about education is a really good one. It's that you're learning, but you don't know you are. And it's something like 40% of people listen to podcasts for that very reason. So aside from entertainment and all of the other things that we listen to our podcasts for, education is a big one. And that's particularly amongst younger listeners, maybe 4-year-olds particularly use it for that reason. And when you look at the profile of our staff, that's exactly what we need to do. So where the pre-COVID, where we used to maybe train people in PPE, how you put it on and take it off, they were all in a big room. And of course, we can't do that anymore. Social distancing has blown that out of the window. So we had to use this as a channel to say the same things, but in a different way. And the other thing that has happened over the year with COVID is people are absolutely sick hearing it. We're all sick of hearing hands, face, space, keep your distance, don't go out, stay at home, all of that. The messaging becomes tired. But what the podcast allows you to do is to tap into those experts within your organisation, and you've got a different voice communicating the same message. So it just brings that extra perspective to it. You're able to look at it from a different point of view, and people love to listen. I mean, I don't know where I do the ironing and I have a podcast on, or for those healthy people that tend to climb hills or go running or whatever that might be. I'm not one of them. But it's that ability to just listen in at a time that suits you. It's the Netflix behaviour. You can, on demand, pick your podcast, decide when you're going to listen to it. And people binge. I mean, I binge on it with a big pile of ironing. I've maybe got 3 of them on in the background. So I think that, as surprisingly, that's what has happened with ours. And the feedback from staff has been great, that this is a thing. So it has grown and grown over the year, and we've become more accustomed to doing them. And I don't see us stopping it. Just because we would come back to some sort of normality. If anything, it has evolved and grown. I don't know what you think, Jane. Maybe what it grew into. There's now the friend of the podcast. We've moved into Trust TV, which is very new.
Very scary and very new, but the next logical, because actually on the board here, not only did it say podcast, but it said vodcast. I had no idea when I wrote that what a vodcast would look like, but it just sounded like something we might do. And lo and behold, here it is. And I think, one of the barriers is getting over there, oh, I can't do that. Oh, I don't know how to do that. Oh, I'm not sure. But actually, when you go diving in with both feet and you're prepared to set your inhibitions aside and just do it, it is amazing what you will end up with. I mean, and what Ruth says there about the professional staff, we have some brilliant staff who are so engaging in how they explain things, and honestly, it is worth so much to get that, and we now have it.
And you mentioned Trust TV. I absolutely am obsessed with that name. And I had a look at it before this interview. I mean, really are owning your own conversation, and you really are owning your own subject matter. Ruth described the podcast giving you an opportunity to share a range of expert voices so that the message can be delivered by multiple people. But did you find that as a result of the podcast and now stepping into podcasts, that your colleagues and subject matter experts are more inclined to have that conversation with you because it is authentic and it's less staged, and they don't have that fear factor? Are you getting more people to engage in comms internally?
I think we have established a really good cohort of people who are not scared of it. And I mean, relatively senior people in the organisation mostly, but not exclusively. But their voices in this last 6-9 months have been so important. I mean, internally important, externally important, because if we do it internally with them and they're confident in it, our ability to then move them into a much maybe more scary external is actually improved. And I mean, I have one, and I'll not name who it is, but he did internal stuff. He did some interviews with us, were brilliant. He's now done externally most media channels in Northern Ireland, and he is absolutely brilliant. A really good educator in a very simple way. So we can develop internally and we win internally, but we also win externally then. And I think more and more people are coming on board with us because, it's gentle. We're not exposing them. We're not scaring them. We're not doing it to make fun of them. We're doing them because you're an expert. Tell us. And I think we have overcome more inhibitions in the last year than I think we would have done in 10 years if we had been working in a normal environment. I mean, I'm sure Ruth worked with, infection control, our infection control staff, has done huge amounts of work with them. And I would say now, they are well known throughout the trust in a way they probably wouldn't have been. And their ability to take what they think and turn it into what we need you to do has been exceptional in this last year, and their development in a year. And I think it's now rolling over into elsewhere in the organisation because people are seeing what you can get, and now they think, I want a piece of that.
Yeah, and you really have got what's really difficult to achieve is buy-in from staff, buy-in from your subject matter experts. But Ruth, this has gone beyond an internal communications channel. There's now an external appetite for it. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, initially we had really seen this as a channel largely to communicate with our own staff. But what has happened is, just as Jane has described, it's very easy for us and easy for our staff to engage in this way and to explain sometimes very difficult subject matter. Just lets you have a deeper dive at it and explore it in more detail. And one of the examples might be vaccine efficacy, vaccine hesitancy. I mean, the whole world has been talking about vaccines for the last number of months, and some people have been a wee bit anxious about it. That leads to misinformation out there, and it's really important then for the trust to become that, to play its part in communicating those broader public health messages, to be that voice of trust and transparency, that people will look to us to find out the truth behind the matter. So we use the podcast then. We're actually in the middle of a series about vaccines and vaccine safety. One of our senior paediatricians is very, very passionate about this. And so she has been speaking about sort of some of the myths or worries that people might have, but what the truth and the science is behind them. So really just allaying some of those fears that people might have before they come forward to get their vaccine. And that had huge response then, obviously publicly, because the vaccine applies to all of us. And I mean, it's been retweeted, for example, by our own health minister here whenever we push that podcast out then. The one thing that I think we have learned through yourself is the repurposability, is that a word, of a podcast, where you call that the long form content. I think that's what we're trying to achieve. And we're just starting out, but with the podcast and with Trust TV, it's a limited amount of effort at the start, but you get a really good piece of work. So you've got a video and an audio piece of work. And from that, we can chop and change and edit it and make it work for all of our other channels, be that social media, where you can have a clip with the link embedded that takes you through to the podcast, We can split it up into sections and maybe run it as a series in our newsletters. So certainly that's something that we have found very useful. It's really well invested time. We get the long form content at the start, and then all of our campaigns and other materials flow from that. So yes, what started out as an internal podcast around specific issues has grown and grown and grown, and I hope it continues to do so.
Jane, one of the cool things about a podcast is that it's a piece of media, but it's a piece of controlled media in a way. So again, encouraging your senior leaders, other subject matter experts that might not be official spokespersons, that they may not do the mainstream press, TV or radio interviews. You can broaden your net. How have people reacted to a podcast? Do they feel safer in that environment?
I think the thing about a podcast, I mean, any content that we largely control is that we can create a safe space for people. And, because it is, it's internal, we control it, we run it, we edit it. I think staff who may be reluctant feel that we can look after them. And we're not out to make fun of them or to make them make mistakes. We're out, as in any media, to make people be the best of themselves. And I think that because we can do it, they feel, I think some of our staff feel that they feel much more comfortable and safe in that environment than they might do if it was an external environment. So it allows them a safe place to practice. It allows them a safe place to feel confident, to, people, I mean, these are really good staff doing brilliant jobs, but this is not their world. So if we can help them be themselves, be their brilliant selves in an environment, and we can make them safe to do that, I think they win, we win, internally we win, and I think it's feeding into an external conversation that is, I think, certainly in the last 2 months when we've been under so much pressure, I think our external conversation has been really strong. I think our staff have been really good where we've used them, and I think a lot of that has been because we've been able to bring them through internally, help them feel safe, and then to really be what they are, which is brilliant. Doing what they do, and our job is to help them do that safely. And I think that's what the podcast and Trust TV to a lesser extent, because it's not as well developed, has allowed them to be, and has allowed us to help them be. That makes sense.
I'm quite fascinated that you ladies kind of opened this interview with the fact that podcast was on the notice board. You'd been looking at it and you wanted everybody else to see the word podcast. Then you said COVID happened and that changed the world. And like, you're in a frontline health provider, you're the Southern Health Trust. And while many other organizations might say we're in a pandemic, this is not the time for a podcast, you actually just totally embraced it because you looked at the communication need as opposed to looking at workload. And sometimes that's a message that I try and deliver. Who is this piece of comms for? Is it for us or is it for the receiver? And I'm really impressed by the attitude. And Ruth, I'll put this question to you. People will be watching this, they'll be enthused, they'll be excited. But I know from my experience, and even you know from your experience, that one of the biggest stumbling blocks is that takes so much time and it's another thing to do. What would you say to those reluctant podcasters?
No, I suppose we all have that idea. There's my nervousness of something new. To my total surprise, this is actually really easy. It was an easy thing to start and an easy thing to keep going. And the unexpected benefits of this are just what I said earlier. When you put that wee bit of effort in, devise the interview, we've got a format that we follow now using a standard set of templates, and we just roll them out. I think that the spin-off benefits that we hadn't envisaged either are how much, our social media is followed by traditional media, and these have triggered all sorts of other stories. We had one of our porters interviewed by Prince William a couple of weeks ago, just because of part of his involvement with COVID, and we pushed that out via Trust TV, and that was picked up by the media. We've had all sorts of other things that have featured in podcasts. We had a gentleman who had recovered from COVID and was been treated by our allied health professionals from all of their different, so whether it was physio or speech and language therapy and dietetics. And the BBC picked up on that story and then they ran a feature. So I think it has so many benefits to doing something that's actually quite straightforward. And I'm a complete technophobe. Jane will tell you I can barely switch on the laptop. But for me to be able to do this and record it, and we've a fantastic team with us then who look after the editing, and they do the intros, the outros, and they've done all of that. We've done it all in-house, and all we've bought is a microphone. We only got recording Zoom a couple of weeks ago because they were nervous from a cyber security point of view. That was the whole thing. So I would definitely, I know that some of our colleagues in Northern Ireland anyway have been in touch wanting to know how you're doing it. They're hoping to replicate it. I think some of them have been in touch with you to find out how are they doing these things, but it was surprisingly easy. But for our staff and our reasons for doing this, we are not frontline, and for those of our staff who were at the start of this pandemic carrying PPE in the boot of their cars and driving around, whether that's clients from house to house, our domiciliary care teams, for them to do that with the fear that they had, because it was fear at that time, it was our small part that we could play that did just making sure that we could say we had done every single thing that we possibly could to communicate with them how they kept themselves safe and how they kept their clients safe. And podcasting enabled us to just do that at another level, because we could text the link out. Our domiciliary care workers don't have access to a PC or to go and pick up a newsletter, but we could text this direct to their phone and put it on our staff app, and so they could listen and then they can watch the associated video. So if we played our part in contributing to their safety for a small amount of time investment at the start, talking the way we are now, it is definitely a thing worth doing.
Speech content is brilliant, and I'm predicting 2021 to be the year of speech content as the social networks embrace audio. We have Clubhouse, that's a new social network. Twitter is emulating Clubhouse with introducing Twitter Spaces. Facebook say they're now getting in on the game. And so, Jane, going back to you, you opened this interview with podcast on the notice board. You must feel a sense of great pride. Like, we're all seasoned comms professionals, right? We've over a couple of decades, we've kind of done everything in the book. How does podcasting compare, in your experience to other communications methods?
I mean, you talk about a sense of pride. I mean, if I was to look back at the whole of the health service in the last year, I mean, what the health service has delivered as a totality has been astonishing. And we are not frontline, but to be able to watch what they did and to be able to in some way help other people understand what they did. So if you're going to ask me about what I think about the podcast, what I think is it has allowed people to understand what we see every day is how fabulous our staff are, right? So as a facilitator, to be able to do that and to be able to use what we now have to do that, that's what gives me pride. It's not, oh, look, we developed a podcast. It's what the podcast enabled us to do. And what the podcast has enabled us to do is, number one, explain how hard this year has been, what our people have done, how they've done it, how brilliant they are. And I think, I do particularly think in the last 3 months, because our rates were so high, because this last surge was so much worse than the first surge, I think, when I look back dispassionately in the last 3 months and how hard that was, I can definitely see that the conversations that we were able to have internally and externally, I think, helped turn the understanding of what COVID was doing into the public domain. And I think people understood it. I think they understand it more. And I think some of what we did helped that. So if you're asking about pride, it's less pride and more satisfaction that we've been able to help that conversation. But the point Ruth makes about, it's not really scary when you do it. I have this thing, and we have this endless conversation about you put effort in for outcome. So effort in should equal what you get out the other side. And I'm very against nugatory work. You put huge amounts of work in, but you don't get what you need out the other side. And you see with podcasts and broadcasts and stuff we've done, I think we've got out multiple what we put in. That would be my, so it's pride in I think we have a way of working that is delivering us huge outcomes. Once you get over the hurdle of, I don't know how this works. Satisfaction in what we've been able to do, satisfaction in how we've been able to drive a conversation. But pride in our whole team, because our whole team has been outstanding. I mean, what they have delivered, we might write it on a board and have an idea, but other people need to make it work. So it's pride in the whole thing. It's not, it's taking a bit of an idea that you have one day and thinking, flip, wouldn't that be good? And actually turning it into what it is. My goodness, the level of job satisfaction out of that is probably pretty immeasurable.
Yeah, that's so impactful. We heretofore have been relying on, rented comms, which is social, trying to optimize on search because Google owns that space along with YouTube. Traditional media, the narrative is driven by journalists and news outlets. We step into vodcasting and podcasting, and you can tell true, authentic stories and, be the representative voice and give a voice to all of those staff. Ruth, we'll give the final words to you. Where will this podcast be in 12 months? If I get you guys back on the show, what will we be talking about? What's your ambition?
Oh my goodness. I think we're already on our second series. So who knows where it's going to go after this. I think what Jane has hinted at there, a lot of what we are having to communicate is often very difficult, very complex, as are many of your audience, Joanne, in the public sector. Often what we're doing is very hard to communicate, but when you're given the space to explain the rationale for why you're doing the things that you're doing, people will understand. And podcasts give us that opportunity. So I don't see it going anywhere other than up. This is a channel and a medium that is growing exponentially globally. And we are just going to keep on building and building in terms of where we're taking ours. So thank you for all that you've taught us in getting us this far.
Well, here, listen, my line, everything is academic until you put it into action. And that's exactly what you ladies did. So congratulations. Those of you listening or watching, you have to check out SouthPod. Make sure you subscribe, you rate and review. Also subscribe to Trust TV. And I'm sure I will be inundated with a request for introductions to Jane and to Ruth. And I'm sure you don't mind if I pass those on to your colleagues in government and public sector.
Not at all.
Okay, ladies, thanks a million. And I will see you again on your podcast as I go listen to the next episode.
Thank you very much.